The talk I'd like to give you is Deemed Consent England, Approaching Families, a Clinical Guide, and I'm trying to be quite practical in this talk for you. So let's look at the steps for approaching families for Organ Donation England and how it may have changed after the 20th of May 2020. First of all, what's completely unchanged is that step one, which is based on referral, speaking to the family with a specialist nurse or a specialist requester, and then leading to breaking bad news. We are still asking for 100% referral. It's sort of the expectation. What we've observed in Wales is that families expect donation to be discussed, and they're waiting for that topic to be raised, and it's not a surprise to them. Additionally, we learned from public consultations that there is actually even a wider societal expectation that it is part and parcel of end-of-life care. What we've also realised is it's very important to explain to families why donation cannot go ahead, or that we are aware that people have opted out. In some communities of the UK, there is a fear that the opt-out is a gimmick or fake, and that actually we never really look at the opt-out register and we just take organs. And every time we can go into a family and explain that we have looked at the register, we have checked, and they have opted out, and we will respect that. That's powerful reinforcement that the organ donor register can be trusted and that donation decisions are respected. When you come to speak to the family, we've spoken for many years about the benefits of having a specialist nurse or a specialist requester present for the breaking bad news conversation. One of the key reasons is they're on hand to answer donation questions, because you never know when a family is going to raise that topic, especially with all the added publicity we have now about deemed consent. Importantly, they can reinforce your message, the doctor's message. There is a certain arrogance that even I have, that sometimes I think I've done a beautiful chat to the family and they fully understand everything I say and they're fully accepting it. But little do I know that when I walk out, actually that's when the questions start, and that's when the true acceptance comes. And it's really helpful to have your team with you to listen to your message, because they can help reinforce it. And I find that's a real advantage, and that's what I would definitely encourage. We know that families are more likely to say yes to DCD, and we published that in 2016. If the specialist nurses are there for all the duration for that day, they're better able to support families regardless of eventual donation answers. A new one that's emerging is this concept that families don't have to meet new staff or retell their story again. And this is some of the feedback we're getting from families during these approach conversations. How that works is typical medical and nursing training is when we get to meet the family for the first time, we say, "What do you know so far?" And the family tells you. But if you bring a new person in after you just told the family that their loved one is dying or will die, then the typical thing was the specialist nurse will have to say, "Well, what do you know so far?" And for the family at that moment to be asked to actually vocalize the terrible news, to say, "Well, the doctor said that my loved one has died or is dying," it can be really hard for families from what we've heard. And also they say it sort of borders on cruelty to do that. So better if you bring the whole team in right at the beginning, who's going to be with them for that whole duration, for that whole day. That works much stronger for families. Really, it's about planning, and having a team approach is the best way to support our families. Also, this is when we do come to break the bad news, we very much follow GPICS 2, where the consultant leads on breaking bad news before handing over to the specialist nurse. And the key thing is you have to be clear that the family have accepted the inevitability of their loss and are ready to consider what may happen next. And those two bits can be quite hard to judge and definitely require planning and the team approach. Having reflected for quite a while on what is a good structure to approaching these conversations, and both reflecting on my own practice and watching a lot of simulation work and listening to feedback, a good structure can very much help you guide through these conversations. And the one we've been using and finding very helpful, we call breaking bad news as a Shakespearean tragedy. And what it really does is to think of this conversation in terms of acts, a 3-act structure with a prologue, exactly as you may see in a play. So why is there a prologue in plays? Well, one is it gives you some information, but most important, it's setting the scene and telling you what to expect. So when we ask the family to explain their current understanding, it's not just to get those knowledge facts of what they actually know. It's a real check. Do they know that this is a tragedy? Or do they think this is something different? Do they think it's an action rescue, that you've brought them in and you're saying, well, your relative's really sick, but I'm Dr. Gardner and I've got this new treatment and I'm sure it's going to save them. Do they think it's an action rescue? I don't think any family will think it's a comedy, but what you're really trying to establish, do they know that, and like you know, that this is a tragedy that we're all going through? It's also an opportunity to consider giving a warning shot. Then in the Act 1, what you do is you take the information the family first gave you and you try to retell the story, and you take care to highlight the facts that, from their story, that make this a tragedy, that explain why it's a tragedy. And you're building off all the time what the family have told you. And what you're building towards in Act 2 is what we call the telegraph reveal, when you will say something like, we think they've died, or we think we can't save them, that they are going to die. And it's going to be a shock to the family. But if you've sort of laid the scene and moved your way up until that sort of telegraphed reveal, it shouldn't come as a surprise. And at that moment, then you've got to be ready to give explanation and provide answer any questions there may be. So what happens though in a normal play when some great climactic thing, some great reveal has happened at the end of Act 2? Well, the normal thing that happens is there's an interval. And what that allows is a chance for the emotions to sort of come down a bit, for the information to be digested and ruminated over, and to really sort of the understanding to really come. And just like in a play, most families, they need that break. And we've been told many times before that once you hear that devastating news, they can barely remember what comes next. And actually, it's useful to try to guide the family, to gently take them by the hand. They've never done this before, but we have. And most families are willing to be taken by the hand and guided through this process and are okay with taking a break. Now, some families may force you forward. They just keep asking, and that's absolutely fine. You've got the whole team there. You're ready to support them, and you'll just go forward. But as much as possible, we suggest trying to guide them towards accepting a break. And then it's in Act 3 that you come back and you start to discuss the end-of-life care. And that'll include things like spiritual support and handprints and visitation and who's going to come. But it can also obviously incorporate donation as part and parcel of an end-of-life choice. And that's where donation belongs. It's just one of many end-of-life choices for the family that we're trying to get right for them. So it had been our hope for these deemed consent roadshows to actually come out in person to you all and actually put on a play or an actual live demonstration with actors and people like us filling in and explaining it. And we weren't able to do that. But what we did do in the Intensive Care State of the Art conference in 2019 in Birmingham in December is we put on a live show, and we called it Choose Your Own Organ Donation Approach. And in that live show, it was like a choose your own adventure where the audience guided what happened in these conversations and the audience could vote. Well, we can't take you through that. COVID has stopped all of that happening, and all that sort of bespoke and wonderful plans we had to really show the complexities and really dig deeper into these conversations. But what we can have show you some video footage. So I want to show you some video footage that takes us through that 3-act structure. So in this conversation, we're thinking about an imaginary patient called Margaret. And you'll see that we have the bedside nurse, and then we have Margaret's sister, Margaret's husband, and then the Dr. Chris and the specialist requester, Amy. So we'll just see how a prologue works.
This is Amy. Amy is one of our specialist nurses, and she helps look after people with part of the team.
Right, hello.
Because we've not met before, it'd be very helpful for me if you could explain maybe what you understand about what's happening to Margaret at the moment.
It all started a week or so ago, I suppose. You've been having these headaches on and off, and then then yesterday, she collapsed while she was hanging out the washing, and then we heard this scream, and then I went outside and I tried to put her in the recovery position while we were waiting for the ambulance to come, and it was just, well, it's all just a blur, really. I mean, one of the other doctors, he had said that she'd had a bleed into her brain, and that she was really sick, and he couldn't operate. It's just a nightmare. And then Karen, she said that Margaret had got worse overnight, and that you were all really worried about her.
So you'll see there that although the team never gave a warning shot, there probably was really no need to do that. All the non-verbals, the nodding, the silence, the agreement was really reinforcing that the family was exactly right, that this is a tragedy. And that's very clear. No one sort of said, oh, no, I don't know why you're worried. Margaret's going to be fine. So it was very clear the warning shot was being given at that moment. So let's roll on and let's look at Act 1. And we'll see in Act 1, you'll see Chris retell the story, and he'll highlight and build off what the family has told him.
Well, it sounds like you've got a very good understanding of what's happened to Margaret. It might help if I just explain again what's happened to her since she came into hospital. So, as you know, when she collapsed at home, the ambulance was called and she came to us. And I wanted to tell you, I think you did all the right things to help her at that point. And you did absolutely everything you could. When she arrived at the hospital, we noticed some very worrying signs. She was very deeply unconscious and wasn't responding to us in any way. And she wasn't breathing for herself. She'd had a breathing tube passed down into her lungs so that we could breathe for her, and we had to give her some drugs to support her blood pressure. She was taken for the CT scan, and as my colleagues yesterday explained to you, that showed that she'd had a very, very serious bleed in her brain called a subarachnoid hemorrhage. Now, when someone has a bleed like that, the first thing we do is we speak to the neurosurgeons, and we ask the question, is there anything you can do to help Margaret and make her better? Unfortunately, they told us there was no operation they could perform to help her. So, as you know, we brought her up to intensive care so that we could carry on caring for her and watch her, and so that we could see how bad the damage that this bleed had caused was to her brain.
Okay, so you can see there's a building up there, and then we'll move on to the Act 2.
As you've mentioned, overnight we've seen some even more worrying signs.
Yeah.
I think you were there when her blood pressure went up very high. Now I think that happened because the pressure inside her head became extremely high because of the bleed she'd had. When the pressure in someone's head goes up really high, it interferes with the blood supply to the brain, and the brain doesn't get oxygen in the same way as normal, and that can cause very serious, lasting damage to the brain. Now, unfortunately, I think that the damage that's been caused to Margaret's brain is so severe that I suspect she's actually already died.
When do you think she died?
Well, Michael, I think that she probably died last night when you were with her, when we saw her blood pressure go shooting up. I think that's probably when it happened.
You can just see that really powerful silence that Chris left after he said died, and you could use the same if you think, isn't going to survive, is going to die. We know that in grief, thinking slows, and it may feel incredibly uncomfortable for the team, but for the family, it's probably nothing. Time has almost just flashed by. And a quick rule of thumb is to think about the concept: if it doesn't feel uncomfortable to you as the speaker or the listener, as one of the medical and nursing team, then it probably hasn't been long enough. Or else you can also see that Chris used another rule of thumb, which was let the family break the silence once you say something as dramatic as that. And that's exactly what happened. Everyone remained silent, and it was the husband who broke the silence in the example. It's a very powerful way of reinforcing. It's when the real emotional impact of what you said is grasped. So what typically happens in these conversations, many of us will know, is the family will sort of ask at some stage in this conversation, what happens next? And ideally, we'd like to be able to take them gently and guide them towards having a break. So we'll see how that plays out.
What happens next?
Well, there's obviously going to be quite a lot that we'll need to talk about. But I think before we do that, what's really important is that we confirm what I've told you, that Margaret's died. So I think the right thing to do is for us to do the tests with you there. And then once we've done them and we've made that confirmation that she's died, then we can all come back and we'll sit down and we'll talk about that as a team together, okay?
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Just so we know one way or the other.
Yeah. At least we'll know for sure then. Yeah.
Okay.
So the words I often use are things like, we need to take today one step at a time. And the first step is to actually carry out the test and just find out for sure. But that was an example of, guiding and acknowledging the question and parking it, and so you can come back to it. But you definitely need to still acknowledge the question when it's asked. So that's Breaking Bad News: Shakespearean Tragedy. Maybe it'll work for you, maybe it won't, but it just allows some structure, and the structure will also help everyone in the team know what's trying to be achieved at each point. And really then it's in Act 3 that we come back and discuss end-of-life care, and that's what the rest of this talk was about. Because we've broken the bad news, and now we're into finding out end-of-life care options, including organ donation. So the first step for the specialist nurse or specialist requester is to establish if there's an express decision regarding organ donation. And that express decision could be written or it could be verbal. And in law, both are equally valid. Now, a written decision will be a check of the organ donor register. Have they opted in? Have they opted out? Have they nominated a representative? But there's also a need to actually look for that verbal decision made in life. And that's going to take some conversation led by the specialist nurses to actually speak to the family and see if there was a verbal decision made in life. It's equally important to remember that the last known decision is the one that carries legal weight, and that's also what you're trying to ascertain. So back to our example, this is again looking at now Margaret has opted out on the organ donor register, and we'll see the conversation with the team, with the family.
As you know from being with us, I'm very sorry to have to say this again to you. Unfortunately, the tests have showed that Margaret has died.
It's what we thought.
Sorry. So, so what happens now?
Well, at the end of someone's life, there's quite a few things that we need to talk about to get right for Margaret. And we're very lucky that Amy's with us because she's a specialist in helping families at this point. So I'm going to let her talk to you about what happens next, if that's okay.
Yeah.
I'd just like to echo what Chris has already said. I'm really sorry that you're both in this awful situation today.
Thank you.
So moving forward now, we need to plan Margaret's end-of-life care to give her the end of life that she would have wanted and get things right for you and her.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, I've checked the organ donor register, and last year Margaret made a decision that she didn't want to be a donor. Is that something that you're aware of?
Yeah, that is something that we talked about, and it wasn't something that she wanted to do. Yeah.
It's actually really helpful that you've had that discussion with Margaret, because it makes these conversations a little bit easier when you know what your loved one would have wanted. So we'll respect that decision, and I'll just talk you through some of the keepsakes and the spiritual support that we can offer you from here on.
Okay.
Okay.
So that's a really good view of best practice and a really good demonstration of best practice, whereby we show that we've checked the organ donor register and that we respect it. And if there was any concerns in the family, that will be allayed, because they know how we take and respect the organ donor register. So currently, if you look at the opt-outs at the moment, in England they're running around 2.6% in June 2020. In Wales it's around 6%. So we certainly are expecting England to rise over time as the publicity and the knowledge of deemed consent grows and grows in the community. So I'm now going to show you another little vignette. It's the same specialist requester, Amy, and now we're talking about an imaginary patient called Philip, and that's with Philip's partner and Philip's brother. So let's just see how this conversation looks.
So there's something really important I'd like to talk to you about now, if that's okay.
Okay.
Because of what's happened to Philip, he's in a position today where he could possibly help to save the lives of a number of people through organ and tissue donation.
Yeah, okay. Yes, of course.
So this is something that, we offer to families that find themselves in a similar position to yourselves, and they tell us that they take some comfort and some solace from something positive coming out of their loss. So I just want to give you a bit of information about what's involved. And
Okay.
Yeah, we're all for it, aren't we?
Yeah.
is that something you've discussed?
Not really. But I don't think Philip would mind giving his organs.
So it sort of begins very well for Amy, like the family's really positive. Yes, of course. And then there's that little question about, is that something you've discussed? And got quite a little odd answer in return. And what we're going to see is, this is an example of an opt-out that's been expressed verbally. So let's just see how it rolls out.
Isn't there a new register now or something? Did Philip sign that register to opt out?
No, he didn't. So that's one of the things I would do, is I've checked that already, and Philip's not signed that. So,
Right.
I mean, unless he's had a discussion with yourselves and said that he wouldn't want to be a donor, then we would consider that he did.
Well, it did. I remember it did say once when the new law came, when he did say something like he didn't want
Oh,
to
really?
be
It wasn't
operated on
serious,
at all.
Mike. He wasn't serious about that.
He was quite firm, he was quite firm on it at the time. He didn't want that.
My aunt had a liver transplant a few years ago, and she's fit as a fiddle now. She's tough as old boots. So I know the benefits of
Absolutely.
organ donation. So
And you're right, organ donation is an incredible thing, and it is life-saving to people that are waiting for a transplant. What's really important is that we respect, what Phil would have wanted, because it's, this is Philip's end-of-life care. We've got one chance to get this right for him, so we have to do what would be right for Philip. We wouldn't want to do something if you felt that he wouldn't want that, because that wouldn't be right.
Well, he didn't opt out of the
yeah, exactly.
register, did he?
No, he didn't, but the way it works now is, even if he's expressed verbally a decision to yourselves as saying he didn't want to do that, that counts the same as going online and opting out online.
Right.
What we don't want you to do is have any regrets about this at all.
I
because
wouldn't have any regrets.
This is about Philip and, his last known decision, really. And if you're telling me that you felt he didn't want an organ donation operation, then we really do need to respect that. Let me put this a different way. If you were on the organ donor register and you really, really wanted to donate your organs, and if your relatives went against that after you died, that feels very uncomfortable, doesn't it? It feels like the wrong thing to do. So the way the law works is to protect people's decisions, and it's to protect what they would have wanted and to do the right thing for them.
Right.
So it's brilliant that you're so supportive of organ donation, because it is an amazing thing, but we really have to bear in mind what Philip's decision was and what he would have wanted.
Okay, I see your point. Okay, we can go ahead then.
So you can see from that conversation the complexity of actually trying to identify a verbal opt-out, but also the primacy that actually it's that decision made in life which counts, and whether that can be written or verbal, both carry legal weight. So you can end up in this sort of odd situation where it feels like Amy's convincing the family that they shouldn't donate, but really what she's doing is trying to bring it back to the person's decision in life, because that's the one that's legally important. Now, if there is no express decision, either verbally or in writing, then we can start to look at deemed consent. And if you remember, deemed consent will not apply to if there's a donation decision made already, and that's what all the previous slides have been about. Those under the age of 18, people who have lived in England for less than 12 months who are not living here voluntarily, those who lack the capacity to understand the new arrangements and take the necessary action, novel transplants and research, and if there is no family or friend of long standing to consult. Now, importantly in this, an independent mental capacity advocate, an IMCA, cannot consent for organ donation because their jurisdiction actually ends at the patient's death. This is a soft opt-out, and that means that families must be consulted and family objection will be respected. Also, faith and beliefs are something we always have worked very hard to explore and respect, but we've got a new sort of momentum with that through all the interaction we've had with faith groups in the lead up to the legislation change. So including a declaration was introduced onto the Organ Donor Register in December 2018, where people can make a faith declaration. We have supported and revised faith pages on our websites, and we have faith-specific organ donation cards. But the approach we're going to be adopting is what we're calling the humble approach. And just because you have on a piece of paper or the family say that they're of a certain faith or belief, it doesn't necessarily mean that the strength of that, it doesn't give you any idea of how strong someone held that or which sort of variety of any one faith they may actually be adopting or following strongly. And the only way we can get around that is to put it back to the families, to have a humble approach by asking questions like, what does that mean to them? What would they like to happen at this moment? And that's the approach the specialist nurses will be adopting, the humble approach. So our specialist nurses have definitely received additional training to lead these conversations so that they can follow the law, follow the associated and quite detailed Human Tissue Authority codes of practice, and approach and support families, including in matters of faith and beliefs, exactly as they've been doing for many years, but in this new environment. So I'm now going to take you through a vignette of an actual deemed approach. And what you'll see as you're watching is I will put up little notes that will explain what you're seeing and explain the background and the context of what you're watching. Let's watch this vignette now.
So what happens now?
Well, if you're ready to talk about it, there is quite a few things we need to discuss with you about what happens for Philip now. We're very fortunate today to have Amy with us, who's a specialist nurse in this area. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to leave you with her and she'll talk you through what will happen next. Okay. I'm really sorry.
I'm sorry to meet you both on such a sad day. I work here supporting families that find themselves in the same situation as yourselves. And I've been talking to Louise. She tells me that you've started taking some keepsakes. So you've done some prints of Philip's hands at the bedside, and taken some locks of his hair. And I know we've contacted someone from the chaplaincy to come and pray with you. Are you waiting for any other members of the family to come and see Philip, or any friends at the moment? No. Okay, there's something really important to consider now. Philip's in a position where he could help to save a number of lives today through organ and tissue donation.
Donation?
Yeah. This is something that we offer to families that find themselves in this position. And we know from our experience that when families support donation, they take comfort and solace from something positive happening out of their tragedy.
I mean, we never talked about that. We shared everything, but we never talked about what would happen if.
How about you, Mike? Did you ever speak to Philip about that?
No, I don't remember ever having a conversation about it, to be honest.
And that's not unusual, I think. Talking about what happens when we die is very upsetting, very sad, and many families that we support haven't had that conversation. But we can talk about that today. Just give you some information about what donation means. Sandra, can you tell me a little bit about Philip?
Well, he was grumpy, opinionated. Yeah, very opinionated, had his own mind, didn't he?
Yeah, definitely.
So do you think if you had an opinion on organ donation, do you think he would have shared that with you?
Yes, definitely. But like I said, we never talked about it, so I don't know if he knew anything about it.
It's not a conversation I ever remember us having, to be honest.
So the way organ donation works in England now is that if somebody hasn't talked to their loved ones about what they want and they haven't made a decision on the organ donor register, then we can consider that they would have no objection to helping save people's lives through organ donation.
I don't know.
To be honest, because, like I said, we've never had that conversation with him.
If it's okay with you, I'd like to give you some information and talk to you now. Just have that conversation with you now.
Okay.
So there's a lot in that conversation. It begins the same, and I really like how Chris's language, I'm not sure if you noticed earlier, he talks about, when he was talking about Amy, the specialist requester, we're very lucky to have Amy, we're very fortunate to have Amy. And that's really how I feel now when I've got a specialist nurse helping with these conversations. They often are there to do the heavy lifting with the families, to work out the family dynamics, to really take my messages and reinforce them. And I really feel lucky when they are there. You'll see that Chris actually left that conversation, the doctor left the conversation, and I'm much the same way. I'm not always there for the full end-of-life care planning conversations. If I've done my job right and explained everything along the way and had a lot to do with the family leading up to that point, sometimes there's no need for me to be there. If the family want me there and the other nurses want me there, yeah, I'm there. But if they don't need me, often I'm off doing other work on the intensive care at that stage. It's okay that donation, it's only one part of good end-of-life care, and we should always think about it in terms of one of many options for the family, and it's best if it's placed in that context. It's okay to lead with the benefits of donation. That's what the family is trying to decide, and if they don't know why they might want to do it, if they don't know the benefits that can come, then it's very hard to make that decision. As you can see, and from the previous vignettes, establishing there is no known prior decision, meaning consent can be deemed, does take some expertise, and that's what the specialist nurses have been trained for. I also think it's not about us, it's about the patient and their family, and we're always trying to get back to the patient, and first and foremost, and also then to the family, and trying to meet their needs. I do think that deemed consent does empower and allow for a positive approach. When the deemed legislation went through Parliament in England, it was actually a private member's bill, a Labour Party private member's bill, that was fully backed and fully supported by the Conservatives, which is, as you realise, quite unheard of or very rare in parliamentary terms. If one parliamentarian in either the House of Commons or the House of Lords had spoken against the bill, it would have died, and that would have been it. No one spoke against it. And I think that should merely mean that we should feel confident when we approach families that we have the backing of the English government, as well as the full backing of society to actually be making this approach and to go through in a positive manner. And finally, what all that you've seen before, the Shakespearean tragedy, the words people are using, the conversation's actually unique for every family. We're not showing you a recipe. There's no such thing as a recipe when talking to grieving families, but it could be seen more of a toolbox and giving you options of how to approach these conversations. A slightly different topic, but quite relevant, is the taking of blood samples, which is just for the very purpose of organ donation. You're not taking it for any other reason, you're just taking a blood sample to explore donation. Well, for that to happen, under the Human Tissue Authority Codes of Practice, you need consent to take those samples. So you can get consent from the potential donor if they're on the organ donor register. You could get consent if you ask a nominated appointed representative, you talk to someone in a qualifying relationship, or consent's been deemed. But as you've seen from the videos, to know whether we can deem someone's consent, we have to actually first discuss with someone from the family to see whether they've had any verbal opt-out. And if you remind yourself of that vignette with Philip, who actually had given a verbal opt-out, it would have been quite wrong to send his bloods off to be analysed for the purposes of donation before we'd actually established that we could actually deem his consent. And this also applies with our COVID respiratory sampling. Sure, there are many reasons on the intensive care and the emergency departments right now for why we're going to send off a specimen and repeat specimens. And if you've got all those other reasons, then go ahead and use those others to make a best interest decision and for the patient. But if you are sending those samples for the only purpose of exploring donation, you really need some consent. So either they're on the register and then you could take the samples on that basis, or you've got at least verbal agreement from the family to continue to explore donation. So if there is no deemed consent because they're in one of the excluded groups, then we're back to where we are all the time, that the SNOD or SR will establish from the family if they consent to donation. So pediatrics, tourists, people who have not lived here for more than 12 months, people who've lacked the mental capacity to understand the change. So step 4 is anyone else, and it's exactly how we've been doing it all these years. Finally, it's important, I think, to end with the fact that this is actually not just some dry law. This is Max and Kira's law. And we know that Kira Ball was tragically killed at the age of 9 and donated her heart to Max Johnson. And you can see Max Johnson there speaking at the British Transplantation Society and NHSBT Joint Congress last year. He was quite an amazing young man. And in the top left, you can see Max standing with Kira's parents, Joe and Loanna, at that conference, and they spoke as well at the conference, and it was just amazing. But my favourite photo is the one in the bottom right. That's Max with a stethoscope, and around Max is Kira's 2 sisters and brother, all listening to Kira's heart inside of Max. And I think that one photo summarises everything that we stand for in organ donation and transplantation.